When child-free people hit their 60s and beyond, do they actually start having regrets? Are they really lonely, and do they wish they had some grandkids on the way?
I remember the conversation well. I was 42, and I was sitting at the dining room table with my new husband, and I had finally decided not to have children. Well, of course you might say, the biological clock had finally wound down, stopped ticking, so to speak. So of course, naturally.
Here's a question. When does your biological clock wind down? I know that most people say you should have kids by 35, not that you can't have them after, but there's an increased risk for complications. And what if you just never had the urge to have kids? You just never had that biological clock start ticking. Was it just never wound up in the first place?
But that would be an oversimplification of a much more complicated process. We have options like in vitro, fertility drugs, egg and embryo donation, egg freezing, not to mention surrogacy or adoption.
I never thought of any of those as ever being an option for myself. Obviously, if you don't want kids, I guess you just never think about any of those things. But other people are definitely thinking about those things for me, because I've had people say, well, you know what? If it's too late for you biologically to have your own child, you could always adopt. To which I'm thinking, no, I don't want kids. That includes any of the options that are out there.
It's a world of choice, and in that world, this world, I chose to remain childless.
I believe she's just going to use the word childless, but I think most of us would probably use the word child-free.
Never before have more women remained childless to the end of their fertility or waited longer before having their first child. Nearly 50% of North American women are making this choice, yet we are still perceived as the exception rather than the norm.
Yes, we sure are. Even though being child-free has been talked about a lot more in the past, probably, let's say, 3 to 4 years, people still assume it's a handful of weird women that are choosing to not have kids.
As women, we need to stop looking outside of ourselves for permission to live how we want to live.
Let me start here with this term childless. I have to admit I have a problem with it, even though I'm using it in this talk. It implies that there's something missing. It implies that there's somehow a deficit in those of us that choose not to have children. And this is interesting, because we're all born childless.
For us, not having kids is actually a gain. It's not a loss. It's not something that's missing. It's a purposeful choice.
And even more interesting, this is a term that is applied almost exclusively to women. We don't hear a lot about men being childless. In fact, my husband tells me he is rarely, if ever, asked if he has children. I am asked all the time. And usually it goes something like this. Do you have children? No. Oh.
How many times has my husband been asked if he has kids?
Have you ever been in a situation at work when someone has come up to you and asked you why you don't have kids?
No, actually that's never happened. You know, I'm a man, so people just don't ask that question.
Okay.
The closest thing that's happened is, I think, like some people that I grew up with when I was really young, and they saw me like decades later. Boy, that ages me. But they totally, like, you know, to me, they're like, what? You're married and you don't have children? What's going on? So I think that was like maybe once, maybe twice that happened. And I was just like, yeah, no, we never had kids. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. And that was basically it.
As though we assume that it is the biological destiny of women, all women, to bear children. And I'm going to propose that our destinies are our own business, a powerful choice we make to be fulfilled on our own terms.
Our destinies are our own business. That needs to be on a t-shirt.
So don't get me wrong here. I love children. In fact, I am a world-class cool auntie. But loving children doesn't mean bearing them. In 1976, when I had my first serious boyfriend, and you all know what I mean by serious, everyone was afraid I would get pregnant. And that concern went on through my late teens and my 20s until my 30s, when suddenly everyone was afraid I wouldn't get pregnant. Right?
People are in your bedroom business, whether you're a young adult or whether you're in your 30s or 40s. Someone's got something to say.
So I didn't get pregnant. And over those years, I went back and forth, exploring options, undecided. Until that day at the dining room table, when I knew that what I wanted, more than children, was a fulfilled life. And choosing to have a fulfilled life in an unconventional way, well, that's just even more radical.
Anything that's kind of unconventional or that doesn't fit into society's box of this is what is currently acceptable and how we should be living ruffles people's feathers. And people feel very obligated to make sure that you know that they either, 1, don't approve, say you're going to regret the choice that you're making, or 3, get into your business about it.
And you know what I say? I tell them, A, I have not regretted my decision yet, and B, I am the expert on my own life. Thank you very much. You can sit down now. And C, if at some point in the future I do want to have kids, you know what? I can figure that out.
So I'm going to take you back in time, further back in the 1970s, and introduce you to a famous woman who might be familiar to you, who made a personal choice in a radical act for her time. Queen Elizabeth I, a virgin queen, which we know based on historical fact is not true. She was a queen. Which brings us to sex. Particularly if you were a married woman, choosing not to have children, it implies that you might just be having sex for pleasure. Another radical notion.
When people leave comments like, oh my goodness, if you're not trying to have a baby, you should not be having sex, I always want to say to people, what century are you living in? Seriously?
But meanwhile, back in the 1500s, Queen Elizabeth is the reigning monarch, the Virgin Queen, excellent PR for a childless woman of her time. Women's choices are severely limited. They can be educated at home, but they can't go to school, nor can they enter professions such as politics, law, or medicine. Women can go into marriage, motherhood, domestic service, or the sex trade, or you could become a nun.
Slim pickings back in the day. Thank goodness we've made some progress where women's careers are concerned, because it was long overdue.
Well, Elizabeth wasn't stupid. She understood the culture she was in, and she chose powerfully her own destiny. Her reign is known as the Golden Age. It brought us new frontiers in art, music, and literature, and a renaissance in thinking that influences us to this day.
Let's just point out the fact that Queen Elizabeth left a legacy without kids. Who says you need to have kids to have a legacy?
Elizabeth chose to untrend. She chose personal and professional satisfaction over childbearing, and it was a radical act. And I'm here to say it still is. We're still stigmatized for making this choice, even though we live in a very different time.
We can all hope for that day when choosing not to have kids is just as accepted as being a parent is. Let's hope that day is not too far in the future.
We are doctors, we are teachers, we are lawyers, we are archbishops, we are judges. We have the kind of choice that an Elizabethan woman could not even have dreamed of. We have the rights, political, economic, and social rights and freedoms that our feminist grandmothers, aunties, godmothers, and mothers fought for.
I think maybe we don't always think about the things that women have done in the past to give us the privileges that we have now. Often maybe we kind of take them for granted. I know that I have definitely taken rights and freedoms that I have for granted.
I'm nearly 60 years old, and the plot is getting tricky. I'm asking myself questions like, has all this mattered? And in my recent book, Untrending, I ask about things like legacy and leave behind. These are big questions. And there's a way that having children begins to answer these questions for us. Having children is a fulfilling and creative act.
I don't put a lot of importance on leaving a legacy, to be honest. It makes me wonder, will I start thinking more about that kind of stuff as I get older? I mean, maybe I will. She is. But again, maybe I won't.
Motherhood gives our lives purpose, for sure. But what about otherhood? Otherhood is another place where we find purpose, wholeness, meaning, and satisfaction, simply by living our personal truth.
When you have to think really deeply about that for yourself, it can actually be really challenging. And if you feel like your purpose is being a mother, you don't have to think about it very hard. Not saying that motherhood is easy, but if you're choosing something else that isn't motherhood to be your purpose, I feel like that takes a lot of introspection. And it might not be something that you figure out right away in life.
It's where we trust that a life of creative purpose is not exclusive to procreation, and that our legacies are not just biological.
Oh, yes.
It includes loving, mentoring, and nurturing the other humans that cross our path. Making poetry, art, or music, or forging a path in entrepreneurship or science, or simply getting up every day and living a life that is true to your own deep choosing.
I totally relate to all of what she's saying right now. And that doesn't lessen our value because society puts so much emphasis and pressure on women to become moms. When we have other people over here doing other things that fill them, it's almost seen as being less than.
Does this mean that I don't wonder what my life would have been like if I had children? Of course I do. And I wonder about that the same way. I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd become an archaeologist, or moved to Paris in my 20s when the notion struck me, or not married my first husband.
I personally don't find myself thinking a lot about that question, like what would my life have been like if I was a mom? And if I do briefly think about it, I'm often just like, oh my goodness, I'm so glad I am not a parent. And mostly I think that when I see my friends with their kids. It's a normal part of human nature to question things. That doesn't mean that we have regrets in where we are right now.
Can we give ourselves permission to live radical lives of fulfillment and embrace a woman's right to choose her own destiny?
Every woman should be given that right to become a mom or to not become a mom. There are still parents out there that put so much pressure on their kids to have children or to give them grandbabies. And if you make the choice not to, you're going to be threatened. More about that story right here.